Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? We're going to be talking about something that's always happening in the world around us. Cultural change. I mean, even just thinking about the last few decades, the way we live and work and connect with each other has totally changed.
And the fascinating thing is that this isn't new. Societies have always had to deal with change, but the difference is that today, it seems like it's happening so much faster on such a huge scale.
Totally. It can feel overwhelming. But that's where anthropology comes in. It gives us these tools that help us understand these big shifts without, freaking out.
Exactly. And the text we're looking at today is perfect for this because it doesn't just throw a bunch of theory at you. It uses all these real stories to show how these big ideas actually play out.
Right. It's about how people experience these transformations.
The choices they make, the challenges they face.
Exactly. So let's jump into a really dramatic example. The rise of cities and the field of urban anthropology.
Yeah.
I was floored when I read that in 1920, only like 3% of Africa was urban.
Wow.
Now it's over half.
That's huge.
I know, it's mind-blowing. And it's not just Africa, it's a global trend. So many people moving to cities.
Yeah, it's a massive shift. And it makes you wonder about identity, about community, about how we adapt to these new environments. And it's not just about the numbers either, right? You've got these sprawling slums that Mike Davis talks about that stretch from Nigeria to Ghana.
It's almost like a mega city of informal settlements.
Right. It's staggering. And it shows the kinds of challenges that come with such rapid urbanization.
For sure. But in those challenges, you also see incredible human resilience, creativity, adaptation, and that's what anthropologists wanted to understand.
And that's where the Manchester School comes in, right? These pioneers of urban anthropology, starting back in the 1930s.
They were really the first to dive into studying cities, right?
Yeah, they went straight to these brand new industrial towns in southern Africa to study how they were changing entire societies.
It's like they were dropped into a totally different world, from rural farms to these bustling mining communities.
Exactly. And the copper belt of Zambia became like a natural experiment for them. You have all these people, a lot of them from farming backgrounds, suddenly thrown into this world of industrial labor with totally different social structures and ways of life.
Right, a whole new set of rules.
And Godfrey Wilson, who was one of the leading researchers, called it detribalization. This idea that people were shedding their old identities, their ties to their kinship groups, and becoming more individualistic, more defined by their jobs, their clothes. He even called them addressed people.
Addressed people.
Yeah, it's like clothing became this symbol of their new urban identity.
Interesting. So at first glance, it sounds like a simple story of progress of modernization, right? People leave the farm, move to the city, get a job, get some new clothes. It's like a story we've heard before.
Right, very linear.
But then you have J. Clyde Mitchell, another anthropologist from the Manchester School, who studied the Kalela dance in Luanshya.
Oh, that's a great example.
Tell me about it.
So you have these Bisa migrants who perform this dance. But here's the thing. It wasn't some ancient tradition passed down for generations. It was actually a new creation, something they developed in the city.
A new tradition.
Yeah, but it was a way for them to connect with their shared identity as Bisa people in this new environment.
So it's more complex than just completely abandoning their old ways and becoming modern.
Right. It shows how people adapt, reinterpret their identities in new settings.
It makes you think about how those same dynamics are still playing out in today's cities.
Absolutely. Those early mining towns were really just the beginning.
It all goes back to this idea that our understanding of who we are, our values, our identities, they're always being shaped by these larger forces of change.
Exactly. We're constantly evolving in response to the world around us.
It makes you wonder, though, how do anthropologists even study something as big and messy as a whole city? It's not like they can just hang out and get to know everyone like in a small village.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for anthropologists, this idea of scale. How do you study a society that's so big and interconnected that you can't meet everyone? You can't see everything that's going on.
It's like trying to understand the ocean by just looking at a single bucket of seawater.
Exactly. So they had to find new approaches, new ways to think about these larger systems, these connections between people and places.
The text mentions a case study in Siaya, Kenya. What was it about Siaya that made it so interesting for anthropologists? Because at first glance, it just seemed like a pretty typical rural area.
Right, and that's exactly why it's such a great example. It shows how even places that seem isolated are actually caught up in these global systems, these webs of relationships that stretch across continents.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
We'll take labor migration. A lot of people from Siaya had moved to Nairobi for work.
Right, a classic migration story.
But They weren't just cutting ties with their home communities. They were sending money back, staying connected to their families, their land.
So even though they were physically distant, they were still very much a part of both worlds.
Exactly. You couldn't understand Siaya without understanding Nairobi, without understanding the flows of people and money and ideas moving back and forth.
It's like they were living in two places at once.
In a way, yeah. And then on top of that, you also have all these internal changes happening within Siaya itself. A new Luo middle class was emerging, with more education, different aspirations, different ideas about what it meant to be Luo in a changing world.
So you have these external forces of globalization and internal social dynamics all happening at the same time.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
And just when you think you're starting to get a handle on it, something like the 2007 election violence happens.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect example of how national politics can suddenly become incredibly local and have these really intense, often devastating consequences.
It's easy to forget that these big events, these global trends, they actually play out in people's everyday lives in very real ways.
Absolutely. And those consequences aren't always what you might expect. For example, Siaya also became this hub for informal cross-border trade with Uganda.
So people found ways to adapt, create new opportunities for themselves, even if it meant bending the rules a bit.
It's that human capacity for resilience, for finding creative solutions in the face of challenges.
But it also highlights how even a place like Siaya, which might seem far removed from global power structures, is actually deeply embedded in them.
We're all connected, right?
Right. But in this case, it's not just a feel-good saying. It's about these really complex systems of power and exchange that shape all of our lives. So we've talked about these huge forces of change, like people moving to cities and globalization and how they affect people's lives. But what I find even more interesting is how people actually respond to all this change. It's not always predictable, is it?
You're right. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. Some people embrace the new stuff, like new technology or ideas, while others try to hold on to tradition. And then there are those who find these really creative ways to blend the old and the new.
The text mentioned the Trobriand Islanders and how they've adapted cricket. That seems like a perfect example of that blending you're talking about.
Definitely. So you have these islanders, and they're known for their traditional trade networks, and then they encounter cricket, this very British sport.
Right. Talk about a clash of cultures.
And instead of just playing it the way they learned it, they completely transform it to fit their own cultural values and practices.
So what does Trobriand cricket actually look like?
But for one thing, the teams can be huge, sometimes over 100 players.
Wow, that's a lot of players.
Yeah, and the game becomes this mix of athletic competition and ritual, with chanting and dancing.
It's fascinating how they took something that was brought to them by colonizers and made it their own.
Totally. They turned it into a way to express their own identity, their own cultural dynamism. And it challenges that old idea of modernization as this one-way street where cultures just passively absorb outside influences. People are way more creative than that.
They find ways to make sense of new things on their own terms.
Exactly. And that brings to mind another, maybe more ambiguous reaction to change. Cargo cults. Remember those? They were big in Melanesia after World War II.
Yeah, I remember learning about the John Frum movement in Vanuatu. It's this belief that a figure named John Frum will arrive with ships full of goods, bringing prosperity and freedom from colonial rule.
And it's easy to look at that and say, well, that's just superstition. But it's more complicated than that.
Right, there's a deeper meaning there.
Anthropologists have argued that cargo cults were actually quite rational attempts to adapt to a world that had been turned upside down by colonialism.
These were people who had seen their traditional ways of life disrupted, who had been marginalized and exploited.
And they were trying to understand why some people had so much wealth and power while they had so little.
They saw how the Westerners lived, and they wanted that same prosperity, that same cargo.
Exactly. And they weren't just sitting around waiting for John Frum to show up. They developed elaborate rituals, often blending Christianity with their own beliefs to try to make it happen.
It's like they were trying to create their own agency in a system that seemed rigged against them.
It's a reminder that what seems irrational to one person might make perfect sense to someone else, depending on their experiences, their worldview.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important point about how anthropology helps us understand the world. This idea of culturally defined rationality.
Right. Just because something seems logical or efficient to us
Yeah.
doesn't mean it will to someone else.
Like the textbook mentioned case in Ecuador where the World Bank tried to help villagers improve their guinea pig production, but the project was a total disaster.
Yeah, the guinea pig puzzle. It's a classic example.
What happened?
Well, the World Bank came in with all these ideas about how to breed guinea pigs more efficiently, how to increase their size and weight, but they didn't realize that guinea pigs had this whole other cultural significance for these communities.
They weren't just livestock.
Right. They were kept inside homes, they were used in rituals, even for things like predicting the weather.
So when the World Bank people started talking about cages and breeding schedules, it totally clashed with the local worldview.
And it just shows that what seems like a perfectly rational solution from one perspective can be completely nonsensical from another.
It's like Solon said about Americans not eating their pets. It's not that we're not capable of seeing dogs or cats as food, it's that our cultural logic prevents us from even considering it.
Exactly. We all have these blind spots shaped by our own cultures.
Which is why it's so important to have anthropology as part of development work, right? To have that cultural understanding.
Absolutely. It's not about imposing solutions from outside. It's about working with communities to find solutions that make sense in their context.
It's about respecting different ways of knowing, different values, different ideas about what a good life even means.
Right. And that brings us to another crucial point, which is the importance of decolonizing anthropology itself.
Because for a long time, anthropology was really about Westerners studying the other.
Exactly. It was their perspective that dominated the field, which meant that a lot of knowledge was filtered through this very particular, often colonial lens.
It reminds me of what Edward Said called Orientalism, that way of looking at the East that reinforces Western power and perpetuates stereotypes.
Yeah, and those same dynamics were happening in anthropology for a long time. But luckily, there's been a big push to change that, to make the field more inclusive, to decolonize knowledge production.
So how does that actually work? How do you decolonize a whole field of study?
Well, it starts by acknowledging those power imbalances and actively working to dismantle them.
So making sure that it's not just Western anthropologists telling the stories of other cultures.
Exactly. We need to amplify the voices and perspectives of those who have been marginalized, who have been spoken for but not spoken to.
It's about who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, whose experiences are valued.
The text mentioned anthropologists like Eric Wolf, who wrote about history from the perspective of those who had been colonized, and Marshall Solins, who challenged the idea that Western accounts of history are inherently more accurate than oral histories from other cultures.
It's about recognizing that there are many ways of understanding the world, and none of them are inherently better than others.
It's about respecting different ways of knowing.
And that's a good place to wrap up, I think. We've covered a lot of ground today, but I hope our listeners are leaving with a deeper appreciation for how anthropology can help us make sense of a world that's constantly changing, a world full of different cultures and perspectives.
Me too. Anthropology gives us these amazing tools for thinking about cultural change, for understanding how people adapt, how they resist, how they create new meanings and new ways of being in the world.
And sometimes the most important thing is just to ask questions, to stay curious, to keep learning from each other.
To be open to different possibilities.
And to remember that we're all part of this incredible, ever-evolving human story.
Yeah.